welcome to the Mariah Jean Fit YouTube channel. I'm Coach Mariah. Make sure you like our videos, subscribe to our channel, and share our videos as much as possible so we can reach a broader audience. We appreciate your support and enjoy the video. Hello, and welcome to another vlog on YouTube or podcast on Spotify by the Fit Minds podcast. Coach Mariah here. Today we're going to be diving into the topic of restricting food groups, and it might look like restricting more than just carbohydrates. You may be restricting things like fatty foods, you may be restricting particular brands of foods, even things like lollies, chocolates, wheat, dairy. You may have found over the years that you have just slowly started to get yourself into this position where you don't eat many different types of foods, or even that you are afraid of eating different types of foods for whatever reason. So we're going to dive into why you shouldn't be restricting entire food groups. And this one's going to be a little bit different to carbohydrates and not the enemy, because we're going to talk a little bit more about other food groups and why you probably need to look at food a little bit more just like that it is just food. How this will help you have a better relationship with food for your mental health, your physical health, and also understand the difference between possibly having issues with things like your digestion and fat gain, and how they can sometimes be, yes, correlated, but also that they are separate occurrences. So, restricting food groups, what does it look like? Do you think that you may be restricting some food groups? If you could think about it already, are there some foods that you know that you just don't eat? Not because you don't enjoy eating them, but maybe because you think that they are bad for you, that they're bad for fat loss. This is a really common one, that people assume that particular foods are responsible for fat gain, or that if you stop eating them, that all of a sudden you're going to lose a ton of fat, and it's the food type. It's really important that I really focus on that the issue is that people are demonizing food types and food groups and specific foods to be bad for fat loss. So this is where we're going to debunk this myth and talk about the idea that food groups are just food groups, and that we actually work on calories in versus calories out, as I've mentioned in previous podcasts, and an awareness of that can actually help us move forward with having a better relationship with our food. So if you think you may be restricting food groups, it'll look a little bit like this: aversion to certain foods or food groups, and demonizing certain food types. Okay, so this may look like avoiding lollies, wheat, dairy, or gluten, just because you think it correlates to fat loss or digestion issues. This is kind of the two common ones that I hear, is that it doesn't agree with my gut. All together, these very blanket statements, black and white. Wheat does not agree with my gut, and dairy does not agree with my gut, and I have allergies and I have intolerances. But where you're seeing that not many people are actually getting officially diagnosed with these allergies and intolerances, and so they're kind of just self-diagnosing. It does feel special when you think that you have a gluten intolerance, or you've got some sort of special allergy, and you think that you are this very unique human being. But it's become very popular to be gluten intolerant, and can be very painful for a person if they do self-diagnose and then go through life trying to avoid wheat or gluten when they probably don't need to avoid it altogether. So there's actually a majority of these cases where people are self-diagnosing where they don't need to, and where it's probably just a case of keeping an eye on the total intake for a few different reasons. But obviously avoiding things like lollies and chocolate, this type of behavior, where this is something that I used to do when I was anorexic and bulimic. I would avoid these foods altogether and try and eat as clean as possible. And that would be, looking like eating oats for breakfast and rice cakes with peanut butter for morning tea. And then lunch would be, a big salad, and there would be no sort of carbohydrates other than legumes in it, which I didn't understand why I made that food rule, but apparently I did. And, afternoon tea would look like a protein shake and a piece of fruit. And my dinner would look like, just vegetables and a lean protein again. So you can see how I have a big sweet tooth, and I was depriving myself of anything that was remotely outside of whole foods. And as a result, I actually ended up developing an eating disorder. Not only was I under eating, but I was also demonizing certain food groups. I didn't eat McDonald's for something like 7 years. It started out as a fear food. I was definitely afraid of McDonald's altogether. And I was afraid that if people ate it around me, I got to that point where if people were eating it around me, I was scared that I would accidentally eat it. So these very irrational food fears that developed from initially cutting these food groups out. And I really didn't understand or justify really why I did it. You know, it was like, I know that I've heard they're bad for you and that are not good for fat loss or maintenance of a decent physique. That's what I'd heard. But I hadn't actually heard it from a very reliable source. You know, it was like you'd talk to people at the gym and they'd say, cut out takeaway foods and, you know, cut out alcohol, etc. And it was kind of, that's as deep as nutrition knowledge got. And nobody was qualified. You know, no one I was speaking to was actually qualified in nutrition studies back then. So this was 10 years ago, mind you. Come a long way since then. I've definitely eaten McDonald's since then, okay? And if you do speak to a good dietitian or nutritionist who's usually booked out, you know, someone like myself booked out online, you'll find that most of the dietitians and nutritionists probably won't eat a lot of takeaway. They won't eat out a lot. They won't eat McDonald's very often at all. And it's not something that they actually call an always food. It's something that they might have every now and then, but it's certainly not something that we see as, you know, anything that's nutritionally very dense. Maybe from a macronutrient perspective, it can tick some of the boxes, but there are some other health reasons why, you know, deep fried foods and saturated fats are probably not so good for you. So we kind of shift away from this idea that foods are, you know, these foods are terrible for fat loss and they're also really bad for you. And we shift more into this direction of, how do we understand the energy value that's in foods? Can we, if I like these foods, can I incorporate them in small amounts? And how do I understand the difference between you not being so good for your gut health and maybe your general health, and maybe you know, it might be that, okay, they're not terrible for fat loss, but we can incorporate them somehow in there. So, and then obviously there are foods in the middle of that. I suppose differentiation, where you might say, okay, well, lollies and chocolate, you know, in large amounts aren't great for your gut. You're probably not going to respond very well to large amounts of those. Are they terrible for fat loss in larger amounts if you go over your calories? Well, yes, because it's over your calories, but is it the food group? Is it the food group responsible for that, or is it just the total calorie intake? And do we look at portion control to try and bring that understanding back in, and of, you know, being able to incorporate these in small amounts, okay? So that's what I'm trying to talk about today in today's podcast and vlog. If you are finding you're really struggling with these demonized food groups and worrying about chocolate and lollies and wheat and dairy and thinking it's just easier to say that I'm allergic or I'm intolerant because I avoid them because I think they're really bad for fat gain, my stomach doesn't agree with them, I'm going to go over a couple of points as to why you may be wrong and where this actually may provide some respite in your life, where you may be able to consume foods you actually like the taste of, that you've been feeling guilty for in the past, in smaller amounts or in amounts that probably are more suitable for, number one, your digestive health, and number two, obviously your calorie intake and your goals. So obviously another sign to look for is things like binge eating behavior with certain foods. As I mentioned previously, I developed a binge eating disorder and bulimia along with the anorexia. So if you're binge eating on certain foods, like these trigger foods that you find are, you know, the ones that you cut out, there's no wonder that you're binging on them, because you cut them out completely altogether. Basically mentally, you know, and this is from a dietitian's perspective, mentally you are depriving yourself for long periods of time and then binging on these foods for the exact same reason, because you've deprived yourself for a long period of time. It's quite simple. So especially after restricting them for things like days, weeks and months, okay? So if you're finding that it's kind of like this, almost like a restriction and binge cycle where you're restricting these food groups and then you might be binging on a whole packet of chips because you've resisted eating them for weeks and months and even years on end, like I did with McDonald's. I went 6 or 7 years without eating McDonald's. But where we start to binge on particular foods, it might be things like ice cream, it might be things like lollies, whatever it looks like, and it can start to become this vicious cycle of deprivation and then binging and then deprivation again. And there's a lot of guilt around that as well, because obviously you were trying to avoid that food group and then you just went back into eating it again. So that's where you start to feel guilty and feel shame around consuming not just that food group, but the large volume of it. This is where you can see disordered eating behaviors start to kind of kick in. And this is where if you think that you're doing this, you really do need to speak to a dietitian. Dietitians who specialize in binge eating or eating disorders are going to be able to help you come out of this if you want to. And that's a really big part of it too. If you want to come out of an eating disorder, a lot of it is we mentally convince ourselves that what we are doing has to be sustained, and that anyone who's trying to help us from the outside is trying to sabotage us. But that was where my head was at 10 years ago. Fast forward to where I am now today, and all I want to do is help other people see the light and understand that you don't have to live in that misery and that restrictive self-control of, you know, this tight cage where you can't fit any of the foods you enjoy into your lifestyle. So another sign to look out for would be feelings of guilt around consuming certain food types. So it might not even be binge eating, but you might, for example, have a couple of lollies in your tracking, in your macros, or you might be flexibly dieting at the moment. You might have a couple of lollies and then all of a sudden you feel this overwhelming sense of guilt. You start using words like, I was a bad girl, or I ate bad, or I made bad choices. And when you really look at it, they aren't that bad at all. You had them in moderation. So this is where we start to see really very concerning behaviors arise. So the next one to look for would be obviously saying things like, carbs don't agree with me, my body needs low carbs. I've heard this a lot lately. I've just found that my body responds better to low carbs. In what instance? You know, are we talking about these the extremes that people talk about, where they've gone, you know, oh, I was eating pasta for lunch and I was eating bread for dinner, and for morning, you know, in the morning for breakfast I was having cereal, and my tummy just wasn't happy, it just wasn't agreeing with me, so I decided to cut all wheat and all gluten out of my diet altogether. You see where the problem is here is people are not paying attention to the frequency they're consuming this food item versus obviously eliminating the food group altogether. So this is where people make very generalized assumptions about things like wheat and gluten and dairy. You know, if you are consuming large amounts of dairy, you may be drinking liters and liters of milk and you're wondering why you're really gassy. It's probably because you're over consuming that food type in general, and you don't necessarily have an intolerance or an allergy because your stomach is saying, please stop feeding me lots of that food type. I'll use the same example. People tend to obviously overconsume things like dairy and wheat quite easily because they are in literally everything. So we see that people accidentally consume wheat every day. They might have a wheat-based cereal for breakfast. They may have some biscuits for morning tea. For lunch, they may have a wrap. And because they're still assuming that because these are different, they look different, right? The food items look different. They're still assuming that they're different foods. So, you know, they kind of taste a little bit different as well, but they all contain wheat. And then lunch is a wrap. Afternoon tea might be another wheat-based snack like some tiny teddies or some crackers that are wheat-based, might be some sarkartars or something. And then for dinner, they're deciding, do you know what, I'm feeling a little bit lazy, I might have a burger bun for dinner. And so here you have basically, you know, 5 serves of wheat for the day already. And then to top it off for dessert, they might have a piece of cake which has flour in it. And we know that wheat-based flour is the most common flour we see in cakes. So again, 6 doses of wheat. And I see this quite often with clients where they're tracking their food and they've got wheat for breakfast, wheat in their morning tea, wheat in their lunch, wheat in their afternoon tea, and wheat for dinner, and then wheat in their dessert. And they say, oh, I think I might be wheat intolerant, or I might have a gluten intolerance, or I might be allergic to wheat. And I'm just basically coming back to them and going, I don't think you actually have an intolerance to gluten. I think you're just eating too much wheat. If you reduce that down a couple of portions, you'd be surprised how much better your body would respond. Your gut health will probably improve. And this is just a simple case of if you ate 7 bananas a day, okay? If you ate between 7 and 10 bananas a day, you're going to experience something which basically displays what happens when you're over consuming a certain type of food. And this is where your gut health responds saying, look, too much acidity, too much of that, too much of these ingredients and micronutrients, I can't handle it, that's it, I'm out, okay? So we've all heard about eating too many prunes and getting the runs. Obviously with wheat, it can happen in the opposite direction where you might get, constipation, you may get diarrhea from too much wheat, same with dairy as well. And have you ever found that with some people who say they're dairy intolerant, that they just say, look, I'm okay with yogurt, I'm okay with a little bit of cheese, I'm okay with, a little bit of milk. there's a reason why you're okay with those smaller amounts. And that's because obviously in the larger amounts, your tummy just doesn't want that much of it. So this is where we see people self-diagnosing gluten or wheat intolerance or dairy intolerance or even sugar intolerance. I've seen that one quite commonly described to me. I think I'm intolerant to sugar, which I find to be really funny because there are literally hundreds of different types of sugars, and there is sugar contained in almost everything that we eat in different forms. Obviously not lean protein sources, but you're looking at things like lactose being a type of sugar and carbohydrate which is processed in the body. And so where people are assuming that, lollies and chocolate, I must be allergic to sugar if I'm over consuming these amounts, large amounts, and reacting to them, not actually thinking about, okay, maybe I'm just eating a large amount of this food and my stomach is responding accordingly. So that would be what I would address about what that looks like, and this is where people probably need to start thinking a little bit more deeply about what's in the foods that they're eating daily. And this is where I talk about trying to have food variety and food item variety, and this looks like understanding what is in your food before you actually can conclude that you have definitely eaten some food variety for the day. So obviously saying things like carbs don't agree with me, my body needs low carb, okay, before you make that assumption, maybe see a dietitian or a nutritionist who will be able to tell you what your current diet looks like and maybe what is causing maybe some inflammation in your gut, or whereby you may be over consuming your calories. So you could be doing both at the same time, you could be doing one separately to the other, and you'll experience different symptoms, or you'll experience crossover symptoms with both of those types of food choices and behaviors. So it's important to differentiate the difference between the two and know what you might be doing both of or just one of. So that leads me to my next point. Obviously, assuming that fat gain and bloating are always correlated, they are not, okay? So if you get a bloated tummy and you've had your 6 wheat servings for the day, and your tummy, if I turn on the side, this is after a full day of eating. Oh, hopefully you can see. There you go. Full day of eating. I'm not at this point, I'm just relaxing my tummy. So really, I'm not bloated today. I don't feel bloated, and there's probably no coincidence because I think I've had 1 serve of wheat today. I had a serving of wheat and bread, and then I had a small serve of cereal. And so I know that for my body and how I react and how I've trialed things, that usually that's okay. If I go a little bit above that and I have maybe 3 or 4 serves of wheat, that's when I start to get a little bit inflamed in my gut, okay? But I don't just conclude that I'm allergic to wheat as a result, okay? So obviously bloating and fat gain do not go hand in hand. They actually haven't been able to really find any sort of solid correlation with this, but you can be bloated, okay, from maybe eating a ton of foods that you might have binged on particular foods, and then you may have also overconsumed your calories in that binge eating episode, okay? So it's very easy to do that if you're eating simple carbohydrates and sugars in large amounts. It is just easy to overconsume your calories. So let's say that instead of me having had 3 wheat servings for the day, that I've decided to eat a whole packet of Maltesers, and then I've decided to eat a bucket of ice cream, and then I've decided to, wash it down with some soft drink. And on top of what I've already eaten for the day, by chance, I probably have gone over my total calories for the day. So this is where we see that the bloating and the fat gain can probably occur at the same time, or not at the same time, but they are probably occurring, but for 2 separate reasons, because we have overconsumed calories for the fat gain, and the bloating is as a result of a combination of overconsuming calories, yes, but mostly because you just eat a ton of shit basically, and it's stirring your tummy up. So just over-consuming calories alone, though, doesn't always upset your gut. Some people can easily over-consume their calories for the day and not feel bloated, and that might just be to do with the food choices they make. If you're in a surplus and you choose to do that, and you may be able to do it without any sort of digestional upset, but most of the time, if you are purposefully over-consuming calories, you're in a surplus, sometimes you will get a little bit of bloating here and there, just because the body is obviously having to keep up with the larger amount of food that you are consuming. So it's important to understand that it's not always in relation to overconsumption of calories being that you are bloated, but also it's not always the overconsumption of a particular food group that means that you're overconsuming your calories. So, if you are consuming nothing but lollies all day and you've still remained under your calorie count, yep, you will not gain weight. It's an interesting thing. You will not gain body fat if you've stayed under your calorie count and you've just eaten lollies all day. But obviously you're not getting enough protein, so you're probably not going to build any muscle or maintain any muscle. You're not getting enough fats as well, so your hormone function is going to go to shit. So this is where we see where we start to understand, okay, cool. So lollies aren't the devil. Chocolate isn't the devil. Wheat isn't the devil. Dairy isn't the devil. What is this all about? Well, it comes back to that whole balance thing, that whole 80% whole food, 20% soul food, and I'll discuss a little bit later in this vlog on how to understand exactly how many of those fun foods that you can probably slot in while still getting enough of your other nutrients and probably avoiding most of that unnecessary bloating and discomfort. So, as I mentioned, some foods, recipes, meals, takeaway items are obviously higher in calories, but it's usually a combination of the high fats, okay? Most people blame carbs. They're like, oh, it's the rice or it's the wheat or it's it's terrible in the meal. Have you ever noticed that takeaway meals are quite fatty? They're quite oily. Some of them are quite they're deep fried. We don't know how much oil they've used. It's usually a combination of the high fats and the high carbs or sugars together, especially concentrated sugar. So if you're looking at deep fried sugary items, even things like Ben & Jerry's ice cream, quite high in fat, quite high in sugar because it has liquid sugar in it. A very high calorie item because it contains both a large amount of fats and a ton of liquid sugar as well. So this is where you can fit a lot of calories into that tub, say versus a high protein ice cream, which may have a quarter of the calories for a tub. So this is so important to understand that it's not just one macronutrient group to blame for high calorie foods and takeaway foods. We actually have fats in there as well. Obviously, what's probably more likely for your bloating and tummy issues, as I mentioned earlier, is just that you are probably over-consuming too much wheat, too much dairy, too many lollies or too much chocolate and too many chips in large amounts. You're not sticking to the portions, or you could just be eating nothing but junk all day, and then obviously your gut is not very happy, you're not getting enough fiber, you're not getting enough micronutrients. If you're blaming these food groups for all of your problems, right, but you're not actually eating any fruit and veggies, you're not getting any sort of real nourishment, you've got to understand that these food groups aren't the problem. It's probably the lack of the other food groups that's the problem. And you can probably have those, fun foods in smaller amounts if you were just a little bit more, balanced with those. So it's not about going to extremes and going, I'm going to go on a cleanse and I'm going to eat nothing but greens and protein powder, and there's no sort of fun foods involved. And it's not on the other end of the scale where you're just doing nothing but eating shit and feeling like shit, okay? There is that balance in the middle, and that's for both your gut health, your digestion, your bloating, etc., and obviously for overconsumption of calories, which, as I said, you can overconsume calories if you eat clean foods, you can overconsume calories if you eat junk foods, you can also underconsume calories, you can put yourself in a deficit with clean eating, and you can do the same with junk food, but obviously you can combine the two together with that 80-20 split, get the micronutrients that you need, and get the fruit and veggie servings that you need, get the digestive help from that fiber that you're consuming from those fruit and veggies, and you can still enjoy some of those foods that you enjoy. So the next point would be that gut bacteria obviously can be sensitive to things like more so saturated fats. So people assume that your gut is really sensitive to, or for some reason, always wheat and dairy, because this is where it's been fashionable, coined quite fashionable to be intolerant to wheat and dairy. But it's actually because in the Western world, we simply just put wheat and dairy in everything. Wheat is one of 9 essential grains that we can consume and probably should be consuming. So there's plenty of other grains, we just don't really use them as much because they're not as cheap to use in processed foods, etc. And then obviously with dairy, same thing. People just put dairy in everything. Brands are putting dairy in everything because it's cheap. You see how cheap cow's milk is, and obviously because it's tasty. So dairy is just one component of our diet, and where people can overconsume these components and basically end up, doing that self-diagnosis thing. So Obviously, saturated fats, as I mentioned, can really throw off your gut health more than anything, to be honest. And also, this is the only food group that we can really, with conviction, say is causing some serious health issues like cholesterol issues. So that's the only food group that's correlated to currently causing some serious health issues. Saturated fats. And it's funny because you wouldn't even understand what they are until you start to do some research into them, and then you'll find out that saturated fats are in a lot of packaged foods that you're currently eating. Not in large amounts though, obviously, but you've got to keep an eye on your intake as a result. Now, another reason, obviously, as I touched on before, is things like too much or too little in the way of your fiber intake. So it's all about finding fiber balance. If you're not sure how much fiber you're eating, start tracking your food. The fiber balance we want to get is about 80% soluble fiber, so lots of fruit and veggies, and then 20% insoluble fiber. You'll find that some fruits and veggies will have slightly different amounts of each. Maybe the skin on certain fruits might be insoluble or soluble, so you've really got to keep an eye on that. But you'll find that a lot of your grains, okay, and wheat, and that type of thing are going to have a lot of insoluble fiber. So this is where people think that they're hitting their fiber intake because they're eating wheat. So what's wrong? Why is my gut health off? Why am I feeling stuck? And it's because they probably are not consuming enough of the soluble fiber from fruit and veggies. And there's also obviously different types of fiber for different nuts and seeds too. So if you are unsure, have a look at the foods you're eating, do a little bit of research and figure out whether or not you actually are getting 80% soluble fiber and 20% insoluble fiber from your total fiber intake daily. The recommendations for fiber intake for women is 25 grams daily and for men is 35 grams, okay? If you're going well and above this, if you're getting up to say, for women 40, 50 grams and for men even higher than that, you've really got to think about, okay, maybe I'm probably trying to eat my food a little bit too clean and I might need to actually include some of these fun foods in. And obviously in that as well with your fiber, if you're finding that you are too regular, your fiber might be too high. If you're not regular enough, your fiber might be too low, or again, you may have too much insoluble fiber in your diet. So again, this probably with that whole wheat situation, you're figuring out this could probably be a fiber issue, not a wheat issue, which we're trying to talk about and solve. Another thing it could be is obviously with your gut health or your digestive issues, could be an underlying condition to be further investigated with a dietitian. Okay, I can't make generalizations. You could have an intolerance or an allergy. Please go and get tested. Dietitians are fantastic. You can get a lot of testing markers, allergy intolerance markers done with a professional. Please make sure you get it done with a professional. If your GP doesn't work with this type of thing, if they're not a person who does testing, make sure you get them to send you to a specialist who can test for allergies and intolerances. This does not include a naturopath, okay? So you need to go to somebody who specifically does allergen and intolerance testing, and this is where you can start to probably rule out some of the things you self-diagnose yourself with, but maybe also find something that might be underlying. And there are things like bowel conditions and that type of thing that probably do need to be investigated with a dietitian if you are experiencing a lot of those extreme symptoms like bleeding, etc. So don't think that this is me shouting out to the whole world that everybody, this is the whole umbrella. This is certainly not for chronic disease and illness patients or clients. So, another reason why you may be experiencing some gut health issues or feeling a bit bloated, and this again is not gaining fat, they're not the same thing. So for some reason women think when they're bloated they must be gaining body fat. You may have too much protein in your diet, okay? Or you may be consuming your protein really close together or large portions of it, men as well. This is where you'll get things like bloating and gas. If you think you are consuming too much protein, start tracking your intake and you'll be able to find out whether or not you are. Get some advice from a nutrition or a dietitian as to how much protein you should be eating. And trust me, it's not always, for some people, it's probably less than what you were eating if you thought you had to have a really high protein intake. And then for the others who don't know or have never paid attention to protein intake, it's probably a little bit more than what you're currently eating. But this can be one of the problems, is too much protein. And obviously too many calories in general, as I mentioned earlier, you're just feeling over full, okay? So just too much food and too many calories, yes, can actually lead to you having some digestive and gut health issues because you're trying to cram too much in there all at once. Obviously high volume foods, as I mentioned, so if you are not over consuming calories, but let's say you're just eating a whole lot of clean foods, and again, that's when your fiber is really high. I mentioned that previously, lots of veggies, lots of fruit, lots of rice, but no other kind of simple carbohydrates because you've demonized them, you may be finding that you're bloated. A lot of vegetarians will find this because they're having to eat a lot of plant-based sources of food. Their fiber might be through the roof. They may be feeling really uncomfortable, not because they're over-consuming calories necessarily, but they're just over-consuming fiber and they're just really full. There's a lot of voluminous food in there. So, what is more likely for fat gain? So that was just obviously what I was talking about, what your bloating and stomach issues are probably going to be more so related to than you thinking it's a specific food type. If you don't have an allergy or an intolerance, or you don't have an underlying condition which is exacerbated by these inflammatory foods. So things like endometriosis and the like, there are related foods to this condition that can cause inflammation in the stomach. So there is a different case there. But what's more likely for fat gain? So this one obviously, fat gain is a completely separate process to experiencing bloating, gas and indigestion. Yes, you can experience both at the same time, but obviously it's an excess of calories and your energy intake value-wise, not necessarily correlated to food types, okay? So fat gain, you could literally drink nothing but soft drink all day and it goes straight through you and you got a nice flat tummy. You think, yeah, okay, I'm doing really well for the day. Like, I've just drank soft drink all day and I've got a really flat tummy, like nothing's happening. But you could overconsume your calories very easily by drinking soft drink all day because it's a liquid calorie, so it's very easily absorbed, goes in and out pretty quickly. And obviously in that, it's very easy to overconsume the calories because it's easy to consume that food item, okay? So this is where you could, for myself, for example, I could overconsume my calories. I could eat, 3,500 calories worth of soft drink. I could drink 3,500 calories worth of soft drink in a day. I could have a nice flat tummy, but as a result of over-consuming my total energy intake and calories for the day, I then have fat gain. So obviously the bloating is not associated, or at least the puffy tummy is not always associated with fat gain and vice versa. So this is what's really important to understand, is that over-consuming your calories will result in fat gain. It is just what happens. I'll probably use alcohol as a better example than soft drink. If I did nothing but drink alcohol all day, it's a liquid calorie, and I didn't eat anything else, yes, I would gain fat eventually if I overconsume my calories. So very important to understand, because a flat tummy and feeling like you have digested all your food and you might be drinking your calories, you might have made smoothies and it might be going down a treat and thinking, yeah, I've got a really flat tummy. And you think, why am I not losing fat off my arms or fat off my bum or fat off anywhere in my body? It could be because you just keep over-consuming your calories, assuming that a flat tummy relates to an underconsumption of calories. So obviously, if you've been overeating your calories and consuming the inflammatory foods in larger amounts, things that that when you eat large amounts of them, like wheat, that you might experience both, obviously. So you may experience the unwanted fat gain and the bloating at the same time. But again, it's because the fat gain was from overconsumption of calories, not the particular food item. And the bloating and indigestion was probably from overconsuming that particular food item because it irritated your stomach. So this is where people can demonize wheat. For example, obviously, if we looked at just counting your calories, reducing your total calories down and also going, you know what, this wheat is causing me to feel really bloated in large amounts. I'm just going to reduce my wheat intake just a little bit. So I'm not going to have 6 portions of it. I'm going to go, oh wow, those biscuits have wheat in it, and then my lunch has wheat in it, and afternoon tea has, oh my gosh, everything I'm eating has wheat in it. Okay, instead of just demonizing wheat altogether, I'm just going to I'm going to try having just wheat for lunch and try to have some alternative snacks outside of that are different grains or from different food groups. And then I'm going to make sure that I'm counting my calories. Wow. What ends up happening then is when you ensure that you're in a calorie deficit, you're still eating some of these foods you enjoy, and you're not necessarily cutting the food group out altogether. You're just reducing what you think might be causing you that gut irritation. Wowee, oh my gosh, look what happens. We start to lose body fat, but we also get to enjoy some of that food that we really like without experiencing those digestive issues. Some people can eat 6 serves of wheat a day and not experience any sort of bloating or gut issues. I haven't met anybody with a gut of steel like that just yet, but I'm sure somebody does exist who can eat wheat breakfast, lunch, dinner, all the snacks in the day, and they don't have any issues. Is this particularly good for your micronutrient uptake and for your general health? Probably not. You will probably need some more variety. Overconsumption of total calories in versus calories out is obviously the major elephant in the room as to what dictates fat loss or fat gain, okay? So it's very important to understand this. Get everything out of your head thinking about different food types, and just for a second, think of food having all different energy values depending on the weight, depending on what's contained in that food, depending on how somebody has made it, how much they've used. I know how complicated that is, but that's a fact. So there is obviously currently no solid evidence to support, and I really want to reiterate this because it drives me insane when people say this. There is no solid scientific evidence currently in literature for anybody who has a nutrition or dietetics qualification. There is no solid evidence to support that sugar is to blame for diabetes, for any sort of major health concerns other than tooth decay and fat gain. Okay, so they're not responsible. Sugar is not, poor sugar. Sugar is not responsible for diabetes. Sugar is not responsible for fat gain, okay? And sugar is not responsible for, your mental health issues either, okay? Let's just put that in there as well. But sugar is not, it's not crack, it's not cocaine, it's not some sort of weird, crazy substance that people have demonized and, sugar is as addictive as cocaine. I mean, to a certain degree, yes, but that's more of that, obviously, that mental relationship with it. It's not a drug, okay? It's not classified as a drug, okay? It's not for over 18s. Probably should be because it's very easy to overconsume sugar. It is very easy to overconsume sugar, and then obviously total calories as a result of overconsuming maybe sugar plus some other things in the day. But sugar is not responsible for diabetes or for fat gain. It's really important to understand that, and that it is, however, very much correlated to when we have larger amounts in our diet. Sugar specifically is correlated to, and that's pure sugar, lollies, soft drink, etc., tooth decay. That's the only correlation direct correlation they've been able to find. So now we've got that out of the way, and if you want to have an argument with me about this, please feel free to do so. But if you're a current sports nutritionist, a dietitian in the industry, and you have current up-to-date studies, we're on the same page. Let's continue. So what does that mean for sugar though? How do we get around this? How do we figure this out? Okay, now we've got this whole new piece of information. It's not really new actually, but this piece of information where, we're finding out, hold on, sugar's not the devil. We can have sugar. It's okay. Why is there a sugar limit? Why do we have a recommended daily intake for sugar? Mostly the tooth decay thing, okay? It's mostly tooth decay because, the government has to get on top of that. Dental issues are a massive problem, especially in the US with consumption of soft drinks. But the other reason that I'm going to say it comes down to is that most people don't understand calories in, calories out. 99% of the population has no flippin' clue what kilojoules or calories they're eating. And so what's really easy is to give people a limit with sugar intake, because at least they know, for a general population, not for athletes, not for people who are training quite regularly, but for general population, it's going to be pretty easy to follow that sugar guide. Don't go over this many grams of sugar a day. And in that case, the tooth decay issue, okay, is the first one. But the second one is because if they can keep their sugar below that intake for the day, they're less likely to overconsume their calories, okay? Why? Because sugar, we know, concentrated, is quite high in calories, okay? So this is where, the aha moments start to go off. Oh my gosh, wow. So obviously we know that a row of chocolate can range anywhere between 100 and 160 calories, depending on what chocolate you like. I love the really caramel flavored stuff, so I always end up getting the high calorie chocolate. Fun for me. But obviously then if you look at the calorie equivalent of that, we're looking at, maybe 3 small apples, and that's let's say sugar versus fructose, for example, different types of sugar, just plain normal, granulated sugar versus fructose. But even in the way of volume as well, if you were to look at that from a calorie perspective, that would be a big bowl of yogurt, okay, versus a row of chocolate. So volume-wise, you're looking at, hold on, this row of chocolate's about this big, okay, and the big bowl of yogurt's much bigger, but you're getting calorie equivalent, and obviously very different macronutrients. Yogurt's much higher in protein, slower digested, okay, and then obviously the chocolate is quickly digested, quickly absorbed, and it does come with some saturated fats as well. So when we start looking at these food items and looking at the calorie equivalents, and we look at volume, low volume, this chocky is low volume, the yogurt is high, slightly higher volume, and then we look at vegetables. Okay, vegetables, for example, if you were to have spinach, a cup of spinach has 10 calories. So to reach this 160 calories, you'd have to have 16 cups of spinach, wouldn't you? So that's a lot of spinach. Okay, so now you're all of a sudden seeing the spinach takes up all this room versus this tiny row of chocolate. So now you're starting to see how it's very easy to overconsume your calories, your total calories for the day, if you eat a lot of sugar, okay? So that's why the sugar recommendation is very easy to go by for general population. The issue we run into here is that if you are training at athletic level, okay, if you're training 5 to 6 times a week, if you're quite active as well, let's say you run marathons, or let's say you work in a laboursome job, you might be a builder, you might be somebody who runs around after kids all day, whatever it might look like. You're burning a lot of energy. The issue is that this isn't a one-size-fits-all sugar intake. This is just a daily recommendation based on the average Joe, okay, who doesn't track calories. And obviously we're looking at, well, for athletes and for people who burn a lot of energy, they actually need more sugar. In fact, they probably should be having more sugar because it's much easier to get their daily intake that way without going over their fiber intake and without having that digestional upset. And so it might look like implementing some simple sugars. If people really don't like chocolate, you can obviously have things like orange juice. You can have Gatorade, full sugar Gatorade, etc. If you are really trying to watch your teeth, maybe in the later years of your life. But there are some alternatives. But really with the orange juice, you're still getting the exposure because the sugars are still in that juice. So there is a lot of misconception around sugar, and it's something that we have to clear up as practitioners with our clients and with the public, that sugar is not the devil. It's total calories that will cause fat gain, and sugar consumed in higher amounts just makes that easier. Okay, so now we've tackled that. What's more likely for digestion issues and what's more likely for fat gain? There's probably some I've missed, but these are the major ones that we like to clear up. So when should you avoid a food group or type? Okay, so I'm going to finish up with these two topics. What to reach for instead. So obviously when you have been allergen tested, as I mentioned earlier, okay, or you have been tested for an intolerance for a food type by a medical professional who specializes in testing in intolerances, okay, it's very important, because please don't go to your GP and your GP says, you're gluten intolerant just by looking at you. That doesn't make any sense. You can't actually diagnose someone with a gluten intolerance or a dairy intolerance without testing them, without actually having these markers tested for. So don't ever let anyone diagnose you, and do not self-diagnose, because it could be a lifetime of misery without chocolate and yummy things like bread, because bread is delicious. So once it has been confirmed, then go and see a dietitian, specifically a dietitian, not a nutritionist, because dietitians, this is where they come in and we step out. Dietitians specialize in things like allergies and intolerances, and they can help out with chronic illnesses and diseases. Maybe one day I will get into dietetics myself, but at this stage I'm more than happy to refer those people out, because it's a very small percentage of the population that actually struggle with genuine intolerances and allergies to foods. And obviously the most common food allergy is actually proper food allergy. I'm talking like, actual food allergy. Most people wouldn't realize it's actually eggs. And I think closely in there is somewhere is peanut butter as well, or generally nuts. So there are going to be allergies and intolerances that people do have, but it's few and far between. And obviously once you have done that, you will need to get help with food choices from the dietitian. Check ingredients of everything that you buy or consume when you eat out for meals, etc. Don't get lazy with it. It is your health, okay? And eventually it could be an anaphylactic reaction. It is very serious for those who do struggle with allergies. And intolerances can develop to allergies as well, or they can go in the other direction. If they're an intolerance, they can actually eventually subside. It's interesting what happens with gradual exposure. Celiac, for example, is something to take very seriously. If you have been officially diagnosed as a celiac, you must take it very serious that gluten or wheat, whatever they've decided for you to eliminate, mostly gluten, is going to wreak havoc on your system. And everybody has different symptoms, slightly different symptoms with celiac, okay, so, but please don't call yourself a celiac if you've not been diagnosed as one. You can limit full sugar soft drink intake where possible, as this shows a higher number of cavities correlated to the consumption of full sugar soft drinks in larger amounts. Okay, so this is what they have found. Those who consume larger amounts of full sugar soft drink, I can't reiterate that enough, are going to have higher levels and instances of cavities and reports and cases. It is just a fact. And that includes alcohol with soft drink, okay? So if you think you're getting away with consuming a Bundy rum and coke because it's got rum in it, think again, you are consuming a full sugar soft drink with alcohol. And this is where we start to see the overconsumption of calories starts to add up. This is why people in Australia, the US, etc. are starting to understand that, hold on, it's not just for the kids drinking sugar soft drinks, it's also for the adults over-consuming alcohol and sugar soft drinks with them. So obviously the swap-ins and swap-outs could be things like low sugar or no sugar soft drinks, okay? There will be the haters on the internet that tell me that, you know, no sugar and low sugar aspartame soft drinks are just as bad as, you know, as the full sugar soft drinks. That's a load of shit. It's not just as bad. I can't stand that comparison. They're not just as bad, okay, because they don't contain as many calories. That's the facts. And they also don't contain fucking sugar. They may contain small traces of obviously different types of sugars technically. Yes, something has to sweeten them, but definitely not as much as what's contained in a full sugar soft drink. So this debate is case closed. There is still to this day companies and universities trying to prove that low sugar or no sugar soft drinks are dangerous or bad for people's health. If you are consuming, you know, liters and liters of no sugar or low sugar soft drink daily, and this is something that's ongoing, you are going to experience significant digestive gut health issues because you are just having a shit ton of fizzy no sugar soft drink, and there obviously aspartame does have some reaction with your gut health. You're going to react to some of these sweeteners and things like that. They are artificial, okay? But if you're consuming large amounts, it's like anything. Again, if you consume it in large amounts, guess what's going to happen? Your body's going to react to it. Consuming it in large amounts is probably not going to be very good for your health, no, because these are, again, artificial sweeteners. However, if you're having a sugar-free soft drink a day, a day, your body can actually deal with that. That small amount, that small, tiny amount of aspartame or artificial sweetener is not going to kill you, okay? It's not going to be your demise. I can guarantee that. So please don't come at me with no sugar soft drinks are just as bad, because they're not. And they're still trying to prove this in literature. They're still trying to prove this for it to actually even make its way into studies and into papers where people are able to say this as qualified nutritionists and dietitians. We will never say it. It's just not a thing. It's never been a thing. Overconsumption, perhaps, maybe not great for gut health, etc. But honestly, every now and then, no sugar soft drinks, they're not going to hurt you. Or obviously things like diet cordial, again, lower in calories and lower in total sugar, which is going to be the winner. That's what we want to do. We want to try and, it's not even necessarily to lower your sugar. It's just that, well, these are easy swaps to lower your total calories if you're worried about total fat gain. Okay, if you're thinking, I'm not losing any body fat, but I keep drinking, alcoholic beverages with full sugar soft drink on the weekends, or I keep drinking full sugar soft drink in general on top of my food, and I don't think I'm eating that much food, this is where you probably can make a very easy swap, because it's not that hard to do. It's not that hard to switch to no sugar soft drink. And obviously for tooth decay. Can't forget about tooth decay. If you're reducing things like large amounts of lollies, chocolate and chips in binge eating patterns, okay? The major reason for this, for avoiding doing that, it's not avoiding the food groups, it's just avoiding eating an entire packet of lollies. It's probably it's common sense. Your tummy is going to hurt, okay? I'm not telling you to avoid eating a whole pack. You can binge on a whole packet of chips if you feel just fine after it, sure, but this is where I tell people, don't avoid the food group, just avoid acting like a dick with it. Stop eating like an asshole. Just gently, treat yourself gently, and remember the last time you did that your tummy didn't feel so fab. The binge eating behavior usually comes from deprivation, okay? It usually comes from long periods of not having this food included in small amounts. So to slowly reintroduce that food in small amounts is the major goal. And obviously the only thing you want to avoid doing is just binging on it. And if you have binged, right, move past it, understand probably how that happened. Why did you maybe not eat enough food for the day? Had you not consumed enough calories for the day? Had you been depriving yourself of that food item for weeks or months on end? And if you are finding this is a continuous problem, book in to see a dietitian. They can specialize in dietary habits and behavioral issues related to food. So obviously on that note, if you are over consuming foods and binge eating on things like lollies and chocolates, and it's just large, like I'm talking like large amounts, like whole blocks of chocolate, etc. And then you feel sick, you feel crap, okay, but you feel sick. Just focus on that. Get rid of the guilt, the calorie guilt. Focus on you don't feel very good physically. Listen to your body. It's trying to tell you something, okay? Moderation is key. Do not overcomplicate the process. Moderating those foods that you really love in smaller amounts, okay, and making sure it fits within your calorie goal for fat loss is key. Familiarize yourself with portion sizes and total calories contained per portion, okay? So it's really just comes back to this whole calories in, calories out, and understanding that the food isn't bad, it just has a certain amount of calories in it, and a large amount will see you eating a larger amount of calories. And obviously the simple solutions obviously is probably don't eat bread, numerous times a day, or wheat products numerous times a day, as I mentioned earlier. If you find that your tummy is just not responding very well to that, taper back, as I mentioned earlier. Make these choices, trial and error for yourself before you start assuming that these entire food groups are terrible, or that you're a special human being and that bread just mustn't agree with you at all. There's black and white thinking versus maybe I'm just eating a little bit too much of that stuff. So on the other hand, obviously I mentioned in a previous podcast with regards to fruit servings, if you're eating like 5 to 6 serves of fruit plus a day, you may actually need more complex carbohydrates, so things like rice and potato that you might have been demonizing previously because they are slower digesting, okay, versus fruit. Or even some fun foods, if you have lots of fruit and veggies and you're just eating more fruit for the sake of it, don't be afraid to have some, if you've already met your 2 to 3 fruit and your 3 to 5 veg serving, don't be afraid to slot in some fun foods in there instead to top your foods up. And that's what is going to lead me to my last point, is what do we do instead? Okay, so of all of this binge eating and demonizing food groups and self-diagnosing these intolerances and self-diagnosing this idea that you need a low-carb diet, because honestly, there's going to be a very rare percentage of the population who actually have like a genuine carb intolerance. That would be crazy, but I'm sure there are some like minute percentage of the population who have a sugar or carbohydrate intolerance, but it's minimal. What to do instead? Don't avoid food groups, okay? It sounds really simple, doesn't it? But I mean, that's the point of this podcast. Please stop doing that. Stop doing it. I've come across it far too much, and I'm actually sick of it. I'm just sick of seeing it. And we must be patient with some people because obviously it's taken them a long time to get there. It's going to take them a long time to get themselves out of this habit. But challenge yourself on your own shit. I've told you this in previous podcasts. So start tracking your nutrition. Understand the basics of nutrition and fitting in that 80% whole foods and 20% soul foods. Okay, build your meals and snacks out with the lean sources of protein, some complex carbohydrates, the 3 to 5 veg, and the 2 to 3 fruit. Keep it basic to start off with, and then obviously if you're left over with your calories and you've got some carbs and fats to work with, which you probably will, you can add in some fun stuff on top to fill out the rest of your carbs and fats. If your fiber is through the roof, as I mentioned previously, well above the recommended amount for men and women, the 25 grams for women and the 35 grams for men, you may be attempting to eat too clean. So this is a clear indication of that. And yes, you can probably afford some more fun food. So I know you're probably thinking, oh my gosh, is this true? Can I actually do this? Yes, everybody can. If you have cut a food group out entirely for a long period of time, try to slowly reintroduce small amounts. Don't get too excited and know that they are accounted for, okay? So obviously if you're tracking, it's okay, it's safe. It's not some sort of magical, this 100 calories of this chocolate is the devil versus this 100 calories of banana is an angel. This is not going to sneak onto your thighs versus the banana. This is not going to give you cellulite versus the banana. It's just that if you overconsume your calories, whether it's with a fucking banana or whether it's with chocolate, you're going to overconsume your calories. So, stop giving chocolate such a bad rap. Obviously, try and incorporate small amounts daily into your plan. Look forward to having some more tomorrow is another one where if you're finding that you're kind of going a bit crazy with this stuff because you've been let free and you're all of a sudden allowed to eat chocolate again and you want to eat every chocolate under the sun, just look forward to eating some more tomorrow. Look forward to the next time you get to eat chocolate again now that you have this freedom. To allow your digestion to get used to the change, okay, give yourself time, so the slow introduction, and obviously mentally for you to become more regulated around the foods that you deemed to be so terrible previously, okay? So it took me a while to make friends with ice cream again. You know, from when it was a binge eating food where I was bulimic, it was actually my favorite food. And now it is a food that I really enjoy in moderation. I never binge on anymore because I allow myself some ice cream daily, and it's a portion. And, you know, I know that I don't feel sick anymore because I'm not over consuming it. And I know when I've had enough. Keep your saturated fats below the daily limit. Okay, so this is again the most risky nutrient to go over for your heart and your cholesterol health. So that's just one thing to keep in mind, is that, you know, if you, as I said, if you really want to look at, you know, avoiding food groups, just make sure that you're keeping your saturated fats nice and low, and that you are not kind of going crazy with things like full sugar soft drinks and lots and lots and lots of lollies, because this is where you can see tooth decay build up over time. And then obviously, finally, before I finish the podcast, look at the way that well-rounded coaches in the industry eat, and also how they prescribe nutrition for their clients. If they're booked out, if they are really busy, if it's hard to get into them, okay? And they are a practicing current nutrition or dietitian, if you want to know whether someone is, you can look them up on the registry, okay? If they've dropped off the registry, there's probably a reason for that. We have a registry for a reason. So there's a registry of Sports Nutritionists Australia, okay? So you can check us out on there. I'm registered and insured. But if you don't find somebody on the registry, most likely that their education is not up to date, okay? And this is going to be a problem moving forward, because then we can't give you that information which you guys need, and obviously we want to give you as it comes to us. So this is where it's important to find someone registered and insured, and obviously with dietitians as well, same thing. Some people will claim to be nutritionists or dietitians. Food specialists is another one, and if they're not on the registry in Australia, you're probably going to have to ask them why and where is their insurance. Are they insured? Have they got a copy of their insurance? These are just very difficult and sticky questions to ask, but I'd be asking these questions if your coach is telling you to eliminate food groups altogether and avoid food groups altogether, specifically if they are making you eat nothing but clean foods as well. You know, that it's only you know, chicken and greens and fish and beans or whatever it might be, and nothing else. There's no sort of other flavor in there. So that's about it from me, I believe, for this podcast. Thank you so much for listening, tuning in. Make sure you have a listen to the other podcasts on carbohydrates are not the enemy, because it does definitely relate quite strongly to this one. But this one is specifically about eliminating and restricting food groups. I hope I have given you some freedom to be able to include one of your favorite foods back into your diet slowly. It can be very different if you've had an eating disorder in the past and you think, do you know what, this is just a bit too sticky, Mariah. I think I need to talk to a professional. Please feel free, and I encourage this wholeheartedly, to book in with a psychologist. Usually there are psychologists that you can get into that specialise in eating disorders, so I do recommend those over a standard psych, or a dietitian who specialises in eating disorders or disordered eating behaviour. If you're showing any of those symptoms where you are doing, you know, continuous binge eating and you've got those patterns happening there where you're demonising, you're afraid of food groups, it's something that is definitely of high concern, and you should definitely get it addressed. So please don't get yourself into the same situation that I was in years ago, and this is obviously why I do what I do today, is to help others, you know, have that food freedom and flexibility and understand nutrition on a deeper level. Okay, hope you have a wonderful day, evening, morning, wherever you are. Thanks a lot. Talk to you soon. Bye.